The gaslights flickered against the October fog that rolled through Boston's cobblestone streets like ghostly fingers, reaching into every corner of the city. Dr. Edmund Whitmore pulled his wool coat tighter as he climbed the granite steps of the Boston Historical Society, the building's Victorian facade looming imposing and dark against the early evening sky. At 42, Edmund had dedicated his life to uncovering the secrets buried within dusty archives and forgotten documents. His colleagues at Harvard often joked that he preferred the company of the dead to the living, and perhaps they weren't entirely wrong. The past felt safer somehow, more predictable than the uncertainties of modern life in 1903. The heavy oak doors creaked as Edmund pushed them open, stepping into the familiar scent of leather-bound books and aging paper. Mrs. Catherine Hartwell, the Society's elderly librarian, looked up from her desk with a warm smile that crinkled the corners of her eyes. "Working late again, Dr. Whitmore?" she asked, adjusting her wire-rimmed spectacles. "You know, there's a whole world outside these walls." Edmund managed a tired smile. "The world outside can wait, Mrs. Hartwell. History has all the adventure I need." She shook her head with maternal disapproval, but gestured toward the back rooms. "The new collection from the Ashford estate arrived this afternoon, box after box of photographs and documents. I thought you might find them interesting." The Ashford name sent a small thrill through Edmund's scholarly heart. The family had been prominent in Boston society for generations, their influence woven into the very fabric of the city's development. Any materials from their estate would be invaluable for his research into turn-of-the-century Boston social structures. Edmund made his way through the narrow corridors, lined with portraits of long-dead benefactors, their painted eyes seeming to follow his progress. The research room stood empty, save for several wooden crates stacked near the large mahogany table. Brass nameplates identified them as property of the Ashford estate, donated following the death of the family's last surviving member. He lit the oil lamp on the table, casting dancing shadows across the walls, and opened the first crate. Inside, dozens of photographs lay carefully wrapped in tissue paper. Edmund handled each one with reverence, knowing that these images represented frozen moments of lives long past. Most were typical family portraits, stern-faced patriarchs in formal dress, ladies in elaborate Victorian gowns, children posed stiffly beside ornate furniture. But it was a photograph near the bottom of the second crate that made Edmund pause, his breath catching in his throat. Two identical girls, perhaps 7 or 8 years old, stood side by side in what appeared to be the Boston Common playground. They wore matching white dresses with dark ribbons, their blonde curls catching what seemed to be afternoon sunlight. Their faces were eerily similar, down to the smallest detail, and they held hands as they gazed directly at the camera with expressions that seemed almost knowing, almost ancient for their tender age. Edmund turned the photograph over, finding a date written in faded brown ink, September 15th, 1902. Below that, in a different hand, someone had written Margaret and, but the rest was smudged beyond recognition. Margaret Ashford. Edmund knew that name from his previous research. She had been the only daughter of Harrison and Eleanor Ashford, born in 1894. According to the family records he had studied months earlier, Margaret had died tragically in the winter of 1902, shortly after her 8th birthday. The family had been devastated by the loss, and Harrison Ashford had never quite recovered from the grief. But if Margaret was an only child, who was the second girl in the photograph? Edmund held the image closer to the lamplight, studying every detail. The girls were undeniably identical, not just sisters, but twins, in every possible sense. Their clothing, their posture, even the way they tilted their heads was perfectly mirrored, yet according to every document, every birth record, every family tree he had ever examined, there had been only one Ashford daughter. A chill ran down Edmund's spine that had nothing to do with the October air seeping through the building's old windows. In his years of historical research, he had learned to trust documentation above all else. Records didn't lie, people did. But photographs, well, photographs were supposed to capture truth. The sound of footsteps in the corridor outside made Edmund look up from the mysterious image. Mrs. Hartwell appeared in the doorway, her face creased with concern. "Dr. Whitmore, I'm sorry to disturb you, but I'm closing up for the evening. The fog is getting quite thick, and I'd rather not walk home too late." Edmund glanced at his pocket watch, surprised to find that several hours had passed. "Of course, Mrs. Hartwell. I apologize for keeping you." As he carefully placed the photograph back in its tissue wrapping, Mrs. Hartwell approached the table. Her eyes fell on the image for just a moment before she stepped back, her face pale in the lamplight. "Oh my," she whispered, pressing a hand to her chest. "Where did you find that?" "In the Ashford collection. Do you recognize it?" Mrs. Hartwell nodded slowly, her voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "My grandmother used to tell stories about the Ashford girl. Said there were strange things that happened after she died. People claimed to see her playing in the common, always with another child who looked just like her." Edmund felt his pulse quicken. Another child. Local superstition, of course. Grief makes people see things that aren't there. But she trailed off, her eyes fixed on the photograph with an expression Edmund couldn't quite read. "But what, Mrs. Hartwell?" She shook her head as if clearing away cobwebs. "Nothing, Dr. Whitmore, just old women's tales. You know how these stories grow with each telling." But as they extinguished the lamps and locked the building, Edmund noticed that Mrs. Hartwell kept glancing over her shoulder, as if expecting to see something following them through the fog-shrouded streets. And when they parted ways at the corner of Beacon and Tremont, her final words lingered in the cold air like a warning. "Some photographs capture more than just images, Dr. Whitmore. Some of them capture souls." Edmund's apartment on Commonwealth Avenue felt unusually cold that night, despite the coal fire burning steadily in the hearth. He had spread the Ashford photographs across his dining table, using a magnifying glass to examine every detail under the bright electric light he had recently installed. The mysterious photograph of the twin girls lay at the center of his makeshift investigation, surrounded by other family images, like pieces of an incomplete puzzle. Sleep had proven impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw those two identical faces staring back at him with their unnaturally knowing expressions. There was something deeply unsettling about the way they held hands, as if they were bound together by more than simple sisterly affection. As the grandfather clock in his hallway chimed 3 in the morning, Edmund made a decision that would haunt him for the rest of his days. He would begin his investigation at first light, starting with the Boston Public Records Office. If there had indeed been 2 Ashford daughters, there would be documentation somewhere. Birth certificates, baptismal records, death certificates, the paper trail of human existence that formed the backbone of his historical work. The fog had lifted somewhat by dawn, revealing a city bathed in the pale golden light of autumn. Edmund walked briskly through the awakening streets, past vendors setting up their carts and workers hurrying to their morning shifts. The familiar sounds of horses' hooves on cobblestone and the distant whistle of a steam engine provided a comforting soundtrack to his journey. The records office occupied a stern brick building near City Hall, its windows barred, and its entrance guarded by a clerk who looked as though he had been carved from the same stone as the building itself. Mr. Jeremiah Cook had worked in the records department for 37 years, and his intimate knowledge of Boston's bureaucratic labyrinth was legendary among the city's researchers and legal professionals. "Dr. Whitmore," Cook greeted him with a slight nod, his voice carrying the weight of decades spent among dusty filing cabinets. "What brings you here so early? The university doesn't usually send you around until the afternoon." Edmund placed the photograph carefully on the counter, watching Cook's expression change as he examined the image. The older man's face grew thoughtful, then troubled, then something approaching fear. "I need everything you have on the Ashford family, particularly any records relating to children born between 1890 and 1900, Edmund said. "This photograph suggests there may have been 2 daughters, but my research indicates only one." Cook picked up the photograph with trembling fingers, holding it close to his thick spectacles. After a long moment, he set it down and disappeared into the maze of filing cabinets without another word. Edmund could hear him muttering to himself as he searched, the sound of drawers opening and closing echoing through the cavernous room. 20 minutes passed before Cook returned, carrying a thick folder bound with red ribbon. His face had grown even more pale, if such a thing were possible. "Harrison and Eleanor Ashford," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "Married June 12, 1892. 1 child, Margaret Eleanor Ashford, born April 3, 1894. Died December 23, 1902, of pneumonia." He paused, his fingers drumming nervously on the counter. "That's all there is, Dr. Whitmore. 1 child, 1 birth certificate, 1 death certificate. No twin, no second daughter." Edmund felt a chill run through him, despite the warmth of the building. "But the photograph clearly shows 2 children. Photographs can lie, Dr. Whitmore. Or perhaps—" Cook leaned closer, his voice dropping to barely audible levels. "Perhaps they sometimes show things that shouldn't exist." Before Edmund could ask what he meant by that cryptic statement, Cook had retreated behind his desk, busying himself with paperwork and refusing to meet the historian's eyes. Edmund spent the rest of the morning poring over the Ashford records, but they only confirmed what Cook had told him. Margaret Ashford had been an only child, born to a wealthy family with impeccable social standing. Her father Harrison had been involved in shipping and real estate. Her mother Eleanor had been active in various charitable organizations. Everything appeared normal, documented, explainable. Everything except the photograph. By noon, Edmund found himself walking through the Boston Common, following the same paths that countless generations had trodden before him. The playground area had changed little since 1902, the same oak trees, the same rolling hills, the same sense of timeless peace that made it a refuge from the bustling city beyond its borders. But as Edmund stood where he believed the photograph had been taken, a shadow seemed to fall across the sunny afternoon. Other visitors to the common began to move away from the playground area, some looking over their shoulders with expressions of unease. Children who had been playing happily moments before suddenly grew quiet and sought their parents' sides. An elderly woman sitting on a nearby bench caught Edmund's attention. She was watching him with keen interest, her weathered hands gripping her walking stick with white-knuckled intensity. "You're looking for them, aren't you?" she called out in a voice cracked with age. Edmund approached her carefully. "I'm sorry, madam, but I'm not sure what you mean." She gestured toward the playground with her stick. "The Ashford girls. They still come here, you know, usually around sunset when the light starts to fade, always holding hands, always wearing those white dresses." Edmund's heart began to race. "You've seen them? Seen them?" The old woman let out a laugh that held no humor. "Child, I've been seeing them for 20 years, ever since I was a young mother bringing my own children to play here. They never age, never change. Always the same two little girls, playing games that no living child should know." She leaned closer, her rheumy eyes fixing on Edmund with disturbing intensity. "But here's the thing that will keep you awake at nights, young man. Sometimes, when you see them playing, you realize that one of them isn't casting a shadow." Edmund felt the world tilt slightly around him. "Which one?" The old woman smiled, but there was no warmth in it. "That's the question, isn't it? Which one is real and which one is something else entirely? The living child trapped with the dead one, or the dead child calling to the living?" As if summoned by her words, a cold wind swept through the common, rustling the fallen leaves into small whirlwinds. Edmund turned to look at the playground once more, and for just a moment he could have sworn he saw two small figures in white dresses, standing hand in hand beneath the old oak tree. When he looked again, they were gone, but the sound of children's laughter, faint and musical and utterly chilling, seemed to linger in the air long after the wind had died away. That evening, Edmund found himself unable to concentrate on his usual scholarly pursuits. The old woman's words echoed in his mind like a persistent bell, and every shadow in his apartment seemed to hold the possibility of small figures in white dresses. He had always prided himself on being a man of reason and logic, but the events of the past 2 days were challenging everything he thought he understood about the world. Determined to approach this mystery with the same methodical research that had earned him his reputation as a historian, Edmund decided to visit the archives of the Boston Globe. If there had been any unusual incidents involving the Ashford family or strange sightings in the common, the newspaper would have documented them. The Globe building on Washington Street buzzed with activity even at the late hour. Night editors worked by gaslight, preparing the morning edition while reporters hunched over their typewriters, pecking out stories that would inform the city's residents over breakfast. Edmund's academic credentials and his previous collaboration with the paper on historical pieces granted him access to their extensive archives. Thomas Brennan, the chief archivist, was a thin man with ink-stained fingers and the pallor of someone who spent more time with newsprint than sunlight. He guided Edmund through the basement archives, where years of Boston Globe issues were carefully catalogued and stored in wooden cabinets. "What dates are you interested in, Dr. Whitmore?" Brennan asked, adjusting his green eyeshade. "December 1902 through the spring of 1903, Edmund replied. "Anything related to the Ashford family or unusual incidents in the Boston Common." Brennan pulled out several bound volumes, the leather covers worn smooth by countless hands. The Ashford girl's death made quite a stir in society circles. Tragic case, that one. But there were some other stories around that time. Things the paper didn't usually cover, if you catch my meaning. Edmund looked up from the first volume he had opened. "What sort of things?" "Well," Brennan glanced around as if checking for eavesdroppers. "There were reports of strange sightings, people claiming to see the dead girl playing in the common. The editors usually dismissed such stories as grief-induced hallucinations, but there were enough reports that some of the more sensational papers picked them up. Sure enough, as Edmund worked his way through the newspapers from early 1903, he found what he was looking for. Small notices buried in the back pages, letters to the editor that bordered on the hysterical, and one larger article that made his blood run cold. The headline read, "Mysterious Children Frighten Common Visitors." The article, dated March 15, 1903, detailed several incidents in which park visitors had encountered two young girls who seemed to vanish when approached. What struck Edmund most forcefully was the consistent description: identical blonde girls in white dresses, always holding hands, always silent until they disappeared with the sound of distant laughter. But it was a letter to the editor from a woman named Mrs. Adelaide Morrison that truly shook him. Published on April 2, 1903, it read, "Dear Editor, I feel compelled to write regarding the recent reports of strange children in the common. Last Sunday, my daughter Sarah was playing near the pond when she came running to me in tears. She claimed that two girls had approached her and asked her to play a game called Follow Us Home. When Sarah asked where they lived, one of the girls pointed to the old granary burying ground and said, 'We live where all the children go when they don't want to be alone.' My daughter is only 6 years old, but she has never told such elaborate lies before. I believe something unnatural is happening in our common, and the authorities should investigate." Edmund's hands trembled as he copied the letter into his notebook. The granary burying ground was one of Boston's oldest cemeteries, dating back to the 1600s. If there was any connection between the mysterious twin girls and that ancient resting place, he needed to investigate. Brennan appeared at his elbow with another volume. "Found something else you might find interesting," he said, opening to a page marked with a slip of paper, from the society pages, about a week after the Ashford girl died. The brief notice announced that Harrison and Eleanor Ashford had donated their daughter's belongings to various charitable organizations, but one line stood out. "The family has also donated several photographs to the Boston Spiritualist Society, hoping they might provide comfort to other bereaved families seeking connection with their departed loved ones." Edmund felt pieces of a puzzle clicking into place. The spiritualist movement had gained tremendous popularity in recent years, with grieving families seeking contact with their deceased relatives through mediums and seances. If the Ashfords had been involved with such practices, it might explain the strange photograph and the persistent sightings. "Mr. Brennan," Edmund said, "do you know if the Boston Spiritualist Society still exists?" "Oh, indeed they do. Have a meeting hall on Beacon Hill. Mrs. Cordelia Blackwood runs their operations. Been doing it for years, though most respectable folks won't admit to visiting her." Brennan lowered his voice conspiratorially. "Word is she has genuine gifts, if you believe in such things." Edmund gathered his notes and prepared to leave, but Brennan caught his arm. "Dr. Whitmore, if I may offer some advice, some mysteries are better left unsolved. I've seen what happened to others who got too curious about things that should stay buried." The warning sent a chill through Edmund, but his scholarly nature compelled him forward. As he walked through the fog-shrouded streets toward Beacon Hill, he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being followed. Several times he turned, expecting to see pursuing figures, but found only empty sidewalks and the occasional late-night pedestrian. It wasn't until he reached his apartment building that he realized what had been troubling him. The sound that had accompanied his footsteps wasn't an echo of his own walking. It had been the lighter, quicker sound of children's feet skipping along the cobblestones, always just out of sight, but never quite fading away. And as he climbed the stairs to his apartment, he could have sworn he heard the faint sound of two young girls singing a lullaby he didn't recognize, their voices harmonizing in perfect, haunting unison. When he reached his door and turned the key, the singing stopped abruptly, leaving only the oppressive silence of a building full of sleeping souls. But as Edmund finally settled into his bed, one thought kept him awake until dawn. If the girls were truly following him, how long would it be before they decided they wanted him to play their game? The next morning brought little relief from the previous night's unease. Edmund had managed only fitful sleep, plagued by dreams of children singing in languages he didn't recognize, and shadows that moved independently of their sources. The autumn sunlight streaming through his bedroom windows felt weak and watery, as if struggling to penetrate some invisible barrier that had settled over the city. After a hasty breakfast of coffee and toast, Edmund made his way through the winding streets of Beacon Hill toward the address Brennan had provided for the Boston Spiritualist Society. The neighborhood maintained its reputation as one of the city's most fashionable areas, with its red brick townhouses and gas-lit sidewalks presenting a facade of respectability that belied the darker pursuits allegedly conducted behind closed doors. The society's meeting hall occupied the ground floor of a narrow building squeezed between a millinery shop and a tobacconist. A small brass plaque beside the door bore the inscription, Boston Spiritualist Society, Esther, 1885, Mrs. C., Blackwood Proprietress. The windows had been painted black from the inside, preventing any glimpse of the activities within. Edmund hesitated at the door, his academic skepticism warring with his growing desperation for answers. He had always dismissed spiritualism as elaborate fraud, preying on the grief and desperation of the bereaved. But recent events had shaken his confidence in rational explanations. The door opened before he could knock, revealing a woman of perhaps 50 years with prematurely grey hair swept into an elaborate chignon. Her dark eyes seemed to look through Edmund rather than at him, and when she smiled, he felt as though she already knew everything about his visit. "Dr. Edmund Whitmore," she said in a voice like silk over steel. "I have been expecting you." "Mrs. Blackwood, I presume?" Edmund managed, taken aback by her immediate recognition. "Indeed, please come in. We have much to discuss, and very little time in which to do it." She stepped aside, gesturing for him to enter. The interior of the meeting hall defied Edmund's expectations. Rather than the theatrical decor he had imagined, the space was appointed with simple but elegant furniture. Heavy velvet curtains covered the painted windows, and candles provided the only illumination, casting everything in warm, dancing shadows. The air was thick with the scent of sandalwood, and something else Edmund couldn't identify, something that reminded him of old photographs and forgotten memories. Mrs. Blackwood led him to a round table in the center of the room, its surface polished to a mirror shine. She settled herself across from him with fluid grace, her hands folded in her lap. "You've found the photograph," she said without preamble, "the one showing both Margaret and her sister." Edmund's heart skipped a beat. Her sister? But the records show what the living world chose to document, Mrs. Blackwood interrupted. "But there are realms beyond the reach of clerks and filing cabinets, Dr. Whitmore, realms where different truths exist." She rose and moved to an ornate cabinet against the far wall, returning with a leather-bound ledger. Her fingers traced down several pages before stopping at an entry dated January 15th, 1903. "Harrison Ashford came to me 3 weeks after his daughter's death," she read aloud. "He brought several photographs, hoping I could establish contact with Margaret's spirit, but when I examined the images, I saw something that filled me with dread. In one photograph, the one you now possess, I saw 2 children where there should have been one." Edmund leaned forward, his scholarly instincts overriding his discomfort. "What did you tell him?" "I told him the truth, though I doubt he believed me at the time. Margaret had not died alone. She had taken someone with her, or rather, something had taken the form of Margaret to lure another child into the realm of the dead." Mrs. Blackwood closed the ledger and fixed Edmund with her penetrating gaze. "Tell me, Doctor, in all your research into the supernatural, have you ever encountered the concept of a fetch?" Edmund shook his head, though the word sent an inexplicable chill through him. A fetch is a supernatural double, a spirit that takes the form of a living person for its own purposes. In most cases, seeing one's fetch is an omen of death, but there are rarer instances where a fetch is created not as a harbinger, but as a trap. A trap for whom? For the lonely, the grieving, the isolated. Children are particularly susceptible. Mrs. Blackwood's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. When Margaret Ashford died, her desperate need for companionship created a spiritual wound in the fabric between our world and the next. Something hungry took advantage of that wound, creating a fetch in Margaret's image to lure other children into its realm. Edmund thought of the old woman in the common, of her words about shadows and the question of which child was real. But the photograph shows 2 identical girls. If one is Margaret and the other is a fetch, why do they look the same? Because the fetch isn't pretending to be someone else, Doctor. It's pretending to be Margaret's twin sister, the sister she always wished she had, the companion she craved so desperately that her dying thoughts gave it form and substance. The implications of Mrs. Blackwood's words settled over Edmund like a shroud. "You're suggesting that Margaret's loneliness created this entity?" "I'm suggesting that death is not always the end of desire, Dr. Whitmore, and that some desires are so powerful they can reshape reality itself." She paused, studying his face in the candlelight. "You've seen them, haven't you? The girls in the common? Edmund nodded reluctantly. Others have seen them too, for months apparently, and they will continue to appear until someone puts an end to their game. But here's what you must understand. With each child they encounter, with each person who sees them and believes in their reality, they grow stronger. The fetch feeds on attention, on belief, on the living energy of those who interact with it. What happens if they become too strong? Mrs. Blackwood's expression grew grave. Then the boundary between the world of the living and the realm of the dead begins to dissolve. More spirits will cross over, drawn by the opening the fetch has created. Boston itself could become a haunted city, where the dead walk openly among the living. Edmund felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. How do we stop them? That, Dr. Whitmore, is a question I have been hoping someone would ask. She rose and moved to another cabinet, withdrawing a small silver object that gleamed in the candlelight. But first you must understand that confronting them will put your own soul at risk. The fetch will try to convince you to join their eternal game, and if you listen too long to their promises of companionship and belonging, you may find yourself unable to return to the world of the living. As Mrs. Blackwood placed the silver object on the table between them, Edmund saw that it was an ornate hand mirror, its surface clouded with age. Even in the dim light, he could see shapes moving within the glass, shapes that looked disturbingly like two young girls holding hands. Are you prepared to face them, Doctor? Whitmore, are you prepared to risk everything to save a city full of people who will never know the danger they were in? Edmund stared into the mirror, watching the ghostly figures dance within its depths, and realized that his life as a simple historian was over. Whatever lay ahead, there would be no returning to the safety of dusty archives and academic debates. Yes, he said, his voice steadier than he felt. Tell me what I need to do. Mrs. Blackwood carefully wrapped the silver mirror in black silk before handing it to Edmund. Her instructions had been precise and chilling. He must wait until sunset, return to the exact spot where the photograph had been taken, and use the mirror to reveal the true nature of the twin girls. But most importantly, he must not let them touch him, no matter how innocent or desperate they appeared. The mirror will show you which child is truly Margaret and which is the fetch, she had explained. But be warned, the fetch will know the moment you look upon it with supernatural sight. It will try everything in its power to prevent you from completing the banishment ritual. As the afternoon wore on, Edmund found himself walking the streets of Boston with new eyes. Every child he passed made him wonder if they had encountered the mysterious twins. Every shadow seemed to hold the potential for supernatural activity. The weight of the mirror in his coat pocket felt like a lodestone, pulling him inexorably toward his appointment with the unknown. At 5:30, as the October sun began its descent toward the horizon, Edmund entered the Boston Common through the Beacon Street gate. The park was less crowded than usual, with most families having departed for their evening meals. Those who remained seemed subdued, speaking in whispers and glancing frequently over their shoulders. Edmund made his way to the playground area, his academic mind automatically cataloguing the changes that had occurred since the photograph was taken. New benches had been installed, some trees had grown larger, and a few had been removed entirely. But the essential character of the space remained unchanged. It was still a place where children played and families gathered, where the living carried on their daily rituals of joy and normalcy. As the shadows lengthened and the temperature dropped, the remaining visitors began to depart. Soon Edmund found himself alone in the gathering dusk, standing beneath the old oak tree where he believed the photograph had been captured. He removed the mirror from his pocket, unwrapping it carefully as Mrs. Blackwood had instructed. The first stars were becoming visible in the darkening sky when he heard it, the soft sound of children's laughter carried on the evening breeze. Edmund's pulse quickened as he scanned the playground, but he saw nothing unusual. The laughter came again, closer this time, accompanied by the whisper of small feet running through fallen leaves. Then they appeared. Two girls in white dresses emerged from behind a cluster of trees, their blonde curls catching the last rays of sunlight. They moved with an odd, floating quality, as if their feet barely touched the ground. Hand in hand, they approached the playground equipment with the slow, deliberate movements of children engaged in a familiar ritual. Edmund raised the mirror, angling it to capture the reflection of the approaching figures. What he saw in the silvered surface made his blood freeze in his veins. One of the girls, the one on the left, appeared in the mirror exactly as she did to his naked eye. A normal child, though translucent and obviously deceased. But the other girl, the one on the right, showed her true nature in the mirror's supernatural sight. Where a child should have been, Edmund saw a writhing mass of shadow and hunger, taking the rough shape of a human form, but constantly shifting and reforming. Its face was a void that seemed to pull at his vision, and where its hands should have been, dark tendrils extended toward its companion. The fetch had sensed his scrutiny. Both figures stopped their approach and turned toward Edmund with perfectly synchronized movements. The real Margaret's face showed confusion and a desperate sadness that tugged at his heart. But the fetch's expression, visible only in the mirror, was one of pure malevolence. "Hello," Margaret called out, her voice carrying across the darkening playground with unnatural clarity. "Would you like to play with us? We've been so lonely." Edmund forced himself to remain calm, remembering Mrs. Blackwood's warnings. "What sort of game do you play, Margaret?" The fetch spoke through its stolen appearance, its voice identical to Margaret's but somehow hollow. "We play Follow the Leader. It's such fun. You follow us and we show you wonderful places where no one is ever alone again. Where do you go when you play this game?" Margaret pointed toward the cemetery beyond the common's borders. "We have a special place where all the children gather. Everyone is happy there and no one ever has to say goodbye." Edmund's heart ached for the genuine loneliness in the dead child's voice, but he steeled himself for what he had to do. Mrs. Blackwood had given him a specific incantation, words in Latin that would sever the connection between Margaret's spirit and the fetch that had been feeding off her presence. "I know what you are," he said, addressing the fetch directly. "You're not Margaret's sister. You're something else entirely, something that feeds on loneliness and death." Both figures tilted their heads in unison, but only the fetch's true form writhed with anger in the mirror's reflection. "You don't understand," Margaret said, her voice becoming pleading. "She's my sister. She's always been my sister. Before I died, after I died, she's the only one who stayed with me." "Margaret," Edmund said gently, "you never had a sister. Check your memories. Really think about the time before you died. Was she there during your birthday parties? Did she sleep in your room? Did your parents ever speak to her?" For a moment, uncertainty flickered across Margaret's face. The fetch beside her seemed to sense the wavering and tightened its grip on the child's hand. In the mirror, Edmund could see the dark tendrils extending from the creature's false form, wrapping around Margaret like invisible chains. "Don't listen to him," the fetch said through its stolen voice. "He wants to separate us. He wants to leave you alone again, like you were in that cold house with parents who couldn't see your pain." Edmund began to recite the Latin incantation Mrs. Blackwood had taught him, his voice growing stronger with each word. The fetch let out a shriek that sounded like wind through a cemetery, and its form in the mirror began to writhe more violently. But Margaret stepped forward, her face contorted with desperate fear. "Please don't take her away," she begged. "I can't be alone again. The darkness is so cold when you're by yourself." Edmund's heart nearly broke at the child's plea, but he continued the incantation. As he spoke the final words, a brilliant light erupted from the mirror, illuminating the playground in stark white radiance. The fetch's scream became a roar that seemed to shake the very foundations of reality. In that moment of supernatural illumination, Edmund saw Margaret clearly for the first time, not as the ethereal figure she had appeared to be, but as a frightened 8-year-old girl who had been trapped in a nightmare of loneliness for nearly a year. The fetch's hold on her began to weaken, its form becoming more translucent with each passing second. "Margaret," Edmund called out over the creature's death throes, "you don't have to be alone. There are others waiting for you, others who died before their time. Your grandparents, other children who understand what you've experienced, but you have to let go of this false companion first." For a moment that seemed to stretch into eternity, Margaret looked back and forth between Edmund and the creature that had been masquerading as her sister. Then, with a sound like a sigh of relief, she released the fetch's hand. The creature's final scream shattered every window in the nearby buildings as it dissolved into nothingness, taking with it the oppressive coldness that had settled over the common. Margaret turned to Edmund one last time, and for the first time since her death she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered, and then she too faded away, leaving behind only the gentle warmth of a spirit, finally at peace. Edmund stood alone in the playground, the mirror growing cold in his hands. Around him, the normal sounds of evening in Boston slowly returned, distant voices, the clatter of carriages, the comforting bustle of a living city. But as he began to walk home, he couldn't shake the feeling that his ordeal was far from over. The fetch was gone, but in the moment of its destruction, Edmund had glimpsed something else in the mirror's reflection, other shadows moving at the edges of the supernatural light, other hungry things that had been drawn by the spiritual disturbance. Boston was safe for now, but Edmund realized that his career as a simple historian had ended forever. He had become something else entirely, a guardian against the supernatural threats that most people never even suspected existed. And judging by what he had seen in those final moments, he was going to be very busy indeed. The following morning brought an unsettling calm to Boston. Edmund awoke to find newspaper headlines reporting a mysterious electrical disturbance that had shattered windows throughout the Beacon Hill area the previous evening. City officials attributed the incident to atmospheric pressure changes, but Edmund knew the truth behind the supernatural event. He returned the silver mirror to Mrs. Blackwood, expecting to resume his normal academic routine. But as he sat in his apartment reviewing his notes from the previous week, a sharp knock at his door interrupted his thoughts. Standing in his hallway was a young police constable, his face pale beneath his blue cap. "Dr. Whitmore? I'm Constable Patrick O'Malley. Detective Murphy sent me to fetch you. There's been an incident at the granary burying ground." Edmund's blood chilled. The cemetery that Mrs. Morrison's daughter had mentioned in her letter to the newspaper. "What sort of incident?" "3 children went missing near the cemetery last night, sir. Their parents found them this morning, but—" O'Malley's voice trailed off as he struggled for words. "Perhaps you should see for yourself, Doctor. Detective Murphy said you might understand what we're dealing with." The ride to the cemetery took them through the heart of old Boston, past buildings that had witnessed 3 centuries of human drama. The granary burying ground stood like an island of ancient stone amid the bustling modern city, its weathered headstones marking the final resting places of some of America's most famous patriots. Detective James Murphy, a grizzled veteran of 20 years on the Boston police force, met them at the cemetery's iron gates. His usual confident demeanor had been replaced by obvious unease, and his hands shook slightly as he lit his pipe. "Dr. Whitmore, thank you for coming. I know this isn't exactly your usual area of expertise, but we're dealing with something beyond normal police work." Murphy gestured toward a small group of people gathered near the cemetery's center. The Kellerman children, ages 6, 8, and 10, were found this morning sitting in a perfect circle around one of the old graves. They'd been there all night in the cold, but they weren't injured, or even particularly cold. Edmund followed Murphy along the gravel path, noting how the other visitors to the cemetery seemed to avoid the area where the children had been found. Even the birds, usually abundant in the old burial ground, were absent from this section. "The strange thing is," Murphy continued, "the children all tell the same story. They claim they were playing with 2 little girls in white dresses who taught them a new game. The girls convinced them to come to the cemetery to meet other children who wanted to play. They stopped before an ornate headstone dated 1847, its carved angels worn smooth by decades of New England weather. 3 young children sat on a nearby bench with their parents, their faces bearing identical expressions of dreamy confusion. The youngest, a girl with auburn pigtails, was humming a melody that made Edmund's skin crawl, the same haunting tune he had heard the twin apparitions singing. "What exactly did these girls tell you?" Edmund asked, kneeling to bring himself to the children's eye level. The oldest boy, perhaps 10 years old, spoke in a voice that seemed older than his years. "They said there was a door in the cemetery that led to a place where children could play forever. They showed us the door and told us to wait while they went to get the key." Edmund exchanged glances with Detective Murphy. "Can't you show me this door?" The children led them deeper into the cemetery, past headstones bearing the names of colonial ministers and Revolutionary War heroes. Near the far wall, partially hidden by an overgrown yew tree, stood a mausoleum unlike the others in the burial ground. Its architecture was older, more elaborate, and somehow more menacing than the simple grave markers surrounding it. The bronze door of the mausoleum stood slightly ajar, though the heavy metal should have required considerable force to move. Strange symbols were carved into the stone frame around the entrance, symbols that Edmund didn't recognize, but that filled him with an inexplicable sense of dread. "The children were found sitting right here," Murphy said, pointing to the area in front of the mausoleum. They'd arranged themselves in a perfect circle, holding hands, all facing the door. Edmund approached the mausoleum cautiously, noting that the temperature seemed to drop several degrees as he drew closer. The bronze nameplate on the door was too corroded to read clearly, but he could make out what appeared to be a date from the 1600s. "Detective Murphy, do you have records of who's buried in this mausoleum?" "That's just the thing, Doctor. According to city records, this particular structure doesn't exist. It's not on any official map of the cemetery, and there's no documentation of who might be interred here. A chill ran down Edmund's spine that had nothing to do with the October air. He had eliminated the fetch that had been masquerading as Margaret's twin, but something else had been drawn to the spiritual disturbance, something older and more dangerous. As if responding to his thoughts, the bronze door creaked open another few inches. From within the mausoleum came the sound of children's voices, dozens of them singing in harmony. But there was something wrong with the melody, something that suggested the singers were not entirely human. "Dr. Whitmore," called one of the Kellerman children from behind him. "The girls are back." Edmund spun around to see two familiar figures in white dresses approaching through the cemetery. But these were not the same apparitions he had banished the night before. These girls were older, perhaps 12 or 13, and their faces held an ancient intelligence that was deeply unsettling. "You sent our sister away," one of them said, her voice carrying across the cemetery with unnatural clarity. "That was not very nice of you." "She was lonely," the other added, "and now she's gone to the place where lonely children go, but we have so many new friends who want to play." The mausoleum door swung fully open, revealing a darkness so complete it seemed to absorb light rather than simply indicating the absence of it. From that darkness came the sound of footsteps, dozens of small feet walking in perfect unison. "Detective Murphy," Edmund said urgently, "get those children out of here now." But when he turned to look for the police officer, he found that Murphy and the families had vanished. The cemetery around him had changed as well, becoming older, more overgrown, as if decades had passed in the span of a few seconds. The headstones bore names and dates he didn't recognize, and the sky above had taken on the grey, timeless quality of a place trapped between worlds. Edmund realized with growing horror that he was no longer in the Boston he knew. He had been drawn into something far older and more dangerous than a simple haunting, a supernatural trap that had been waiting in the cemetery for someone with the ability to see beyond the veil between worlds. The two girls in white dresses smiled at him with expressions of terrible knowledge, and from the darkness of the mausoleum came the sound of children's laughter that held no joy whatsoever. "Welcome to our playground, Dr. Whitmore," they said in unison. "We have been waiting so long for someone like you to join our games." As the first of the shadow children began to emerge from the mausoleum, Edmund realized that his ordeal was far from over. In fact, it had only just begun. Edmund's academic mind struggled to process what he was witnessing. The children emerging from the mausoleum were not quite solid, not quite transparent. They existed in some liminal space between life and death, their forms shifting and wavering like reflections in disturbed water. Some wore clothing from different eras, colonial dress, Victorian mourning attire, and more recent fashions from the 1890s. All shared the same hollow, ancient eyes that seemed far too old for their young faces. "You destroyed our newest sister," the taller of the two girls in white said, her voice carrying an accusatory tone that chilled Edmund to his core. "Margaret was just learning to play our games properly." "She wasn't your sister," Edmund replied, forcing his voice to remain steady despite the supernatural horror surrounding him. "She was a lonely child, trapped by something that fed on her pain." The shorter girl laughed, a sound like wind chimes made of bone. "All children are lonely, Dr. Whitmore. All children want someone to play with, someone who understands their games. We provide that companionship." As more shadow children gathered around the mausoleum, Edmund began to understand the true scope of what he was facing. This wasn't simply a haunting or even a particularly dangerous supernatural entity. This was something far older, a collection of spirits that had been gathering lost children for centuries, building an otherworldly playground where the rules of life and death no longer applied. "How long have you been collecting them?" he asked, hoping to buy time while he formulated some kind of plan. "Since the city was young," the first girl replied. "Since the first colonists buried their dead in this ground. Children have always died before their time, and we have always been here to comfort them, to give them eternal playmates." "But the living children," Edmund pressed, "the ones you've been approaching in the common, what happens to them?" The two girls exchanged glances that held centuries of shared secrets. "They have a choice," the second girl said. "They can return to their lonely lives in the world of the living, or they can join us in a place where they will never be alone again. And if they choose to join you, then they become like us, eternal, happy, free from the pain of growing up in a world that doesn't understand them." Edmund felt sick as the full implications became clear. These entities weren't just collecting the spirits of dead children, they were actively recruiting living ones, offering them a supernatural escape from the normal difficulties of childhood. The Kellerman children, he said. "What did you do to them?" "Nothing they didn't want," the first girl replied with mock innocence. "We simply showed them what we could offer. The choice was theirs to make, but they returned to their families. This time, but the door has been opened in their minds, Dr. Whitmore. They know we exist now. They know where to find us when the living world becomes too difficult to bear." Edmund realized that he was trapped in more ways than one. Not only was he physically imprisoned in this supernatural version of the cemetery, but the entities had revealed their long-term strategy. They weren't content with passive haunting. They were actively expanding their influence, using each encounter with living children to plant seeds that might eventually bear fruit. "What do you want from me?" he asked. The shadow children began to move closer, forming a circle around Edmund, much as the Kellerman children had done around the mausoleum. Their whispered voices created a chorus that seemed to emanate from the very ground beneath his feet. "You have the sight," the taller girl explained. "You can see between worlds, navigate the spaces where the living and the dead intersect. We need someone like you to help us reach more children, to show them the wonders we can offer." "I'll never help you harm children." The shorter girl's expression turned sad, but there was nothing human in her sorrow. "Harm them? Dr. Whitmore, we love them. We protect them from the cruelties of the adult world, from the disappointments and heartaches that await them if they continue to grow up. In our realm, they remain innocent forever." "Innocence without choice isn't innocence at all," Edmund countered. "It's imprisonment." The shadow children's whispers grew louder, more insistent, and Edmund felt a strange tugging sensation in his mind. The entities were trying to influence his thoughts, to make their offer seem reasonable and beneficial. He fought against the mental intrusion, drawing on every bit of willpower and academic skepticism he possessed. "You were lonely too, weren't you, Dr. Whitmore?" the first girl continued, her voice taking on a hypnotic quality. "Spending your life among dusty books and forgotten documents, preferring the company of the dead to the complications of the living. We understand that loneliness. We can cure it." For a moment, Edmund felt the terrible appeal of their offer. He had indeed been lonely, had indeed found more comfort in his historical research than in human relationships. The promise of eternal companionship, of never having to face isolation again, tugged at a deep part of his psyche. But then he remembered Margaret's genuine relief when she had finally been freed from the fetch's influence. He thought of the Kellerman children, sitting in a circle around the mausoleum all night, slowly being prepared for a choice that would steal their futures. He thought of all the living children in Boston who might encounter these entities in the months and years to come. "No," he said firmly, his voice cutting through the hypnotic whispers. "I won't help you, and I won't join you. What you're offering isn't love, it's spiritual predation." The two girls' expressions hardened, and the shadow children stopped their circling. The temperature in the supernatural cemetery dropped even further, and frost began to form on the weathered headstones. "Then you will remain here," the first girl said, her voice now devoid of false sweetness. "Not as one of us, but as a warning to others who might interfere with our work. Your spirit will be trapped in this place, conscious but powerless, watching as we continue to gather new playmates." The shadow children began to close in, their forms becoming more solid and menacing. Edmund realized that he had perhaps minutes before they overwhelmed him completely. He needed to find a way back to the real world, but more importantly, he needed to find a way to stop these entities permanently. As the supernatural cold began to seep into his bones, Edmund remembered something Mrs. Blackwood had mentioned during their conversation. She had spoken of spiritual wounds, of places where the barrier between worlds had been damaged. If this mausoleum was indeed such a place, then perhaps it could be healed. But first, he had to survive long enough to try. The shadow children reached out with hands that felt like ice and grave dirt, and Edmund realized that his battle for Boston's children and his own soul was about to begin in earnest. As the shadow children reached for him with their ice-cold fingers, Edmund felt a surge of desperate inspiration. In his coat pocket, alongside his notebook and pen, he carried something he had almost forgotten, a small wooden cross that had belonged to his grandmother, a woman who had possessed an unshakable faith in the power of sacred objects to ward off evil. Edmund had never been particularly religious, but his scholarly research had taught him that belief itself could be a powerful force when confronting supernatural entities. He grasped the cross tightly, focusing all his will on the memory of his grandmother's unwavering conviction that good could triumph over evil. The effect was immediate and dramatic. A warm golden light emanated from the wooden cross, pushing back the gathering shadow children and causing the two girls in white to step backward with expressions of pain and anger. The supernatural cold that had been seeping into Edmund's bones was replaced by a comforting warmth that seemed to strengthen his resolve. "Clever," the taller girl hissed, her beautiful face contorting with rage. "But parlor tricks will not save you for long, Dr. Whitmore. This is our domain, and we are far stronger here than any symbol of the living world's faith." Edmund knew she was right. The cross had bought him time, but it wouldn't be enough to escape the supernatural trap entirely. He needed to find the source of the entity's power and find a way to sever their connection to the living world permanently. As he backed toward the mausoleum, keeping the cross raised before him, Edmund noticed something odd about the strange symbols carved into the stone frame around the entrance. They weren't random occult markings as he had first assumed. They were a combination of early colonial religious symbols and much older designs that seemed to predate European settlement entirely. "This isn't just a tomb," he said aloud, the realization hitting him like a physical blow. "This is a seal. Someone in the colonial period discovered these entities and tried to contain them." The shorter girl's laugh held no humor whatsoever. "Such a clever historian. Yes, the Puritan ministers found us in 1692 during their obsession with witchcraft and supernatural dangers. They thought they could imprison us with prayers and holy symbols. But seals can weaken over time," Edmund continued, his academic mind racing to piece together the historical puzzle. "Especially if they're not properly maintained. The spiritual disturbance I caused last night when I banished the fetch, it damaged the containment, didn't it?" The two girls exchanged glances that confirmed his theory. The ancient seal that had kept these entities confined to the cemetery had been compromised, allowing them to extend their influence into the living world. That was why they had been able to approach children in the common, why they had been able to draw the Kellerman children to the cemetery. "Even if you understand the truth, it changes nothing," the first girl said. "The seal cannot be repaired by one man with a wooden cross. It would require a gathering of faith, a collective belief strong enough to reshape the spiritual architecture of this place." Edmund's mind raced as he considered the implications. If the colonial ministers had created the original seal through collective prayer and shared faith, then perhaps a similar gathering could repair the damage. But how could he organize such a thing when he was trapped in this supernatural version of the cemetery? That was when he heard it, faint but unmistakable, the sound of voices calling his name, echoing across the graveyard as if from a great distance. Detective Murphy's voice, Mrs. Blackwood's voice, and others he didn't recognize, all searching for him in what he realized must be the real cemetery. "They're looking for you in the living world," the shorter girl said with amusement. "But you're not there anymore, are you? You're here with us in the space between spaces, and soon you'll forget that any other world ever existed." But Edmund had an idea. If the voices could reach across the barrier between worlds, then perhaps communication could flow in the other direction as well. He thought of Mrs. Blackwood's spiritual abilities, of her connection to supernatural forces. If anyone could hear him across the dimensional divide, it would be her. Raising his voice as loud as he could, Edmund began to shout instructions to the searchers he hoped were still looking for him. He told them about the seal, about the symbols on the mausoleum, about the need for collective faith to repair the spiritual damage. He shouted until his throat was raw, praying that somehow his words would reach the living world. The shadow children pressed closer, their forms becoming more aggressive as they sensed his plan. The two girls in white began to chant in a language that predated English, trying to drown out his voice with their otherworldly incantations. But Edmund's desperate gambit seemed to be working. The voices calling his name grew stronger, and he could hear Mrs. Blackwood shouting instructions to others. She had heard him, had understood what needed to be done. "Gather the faithful," Edmund called out, his voice echoing strangely in the supernatural space. "Priests, ministers, anyone with genuine belief, form a circle around the mausoleum and pray together. The seal can be restored, but it requires collective faith." The shadow children lunged forward, their cold touches burning like fire wherever they made contact with Edmund's skin. But the wooden cross continued to glow with protective light, and Edmund's determination to save Boston's children gave him strength he didn't know he possessed. Through the dimensional barrier he could hear the sound of gathering voices. Mrs. Blackwood coordinating with Detective Murphy, someone running to fetch ministers from nearby churches, the Kellerman children's parents adding their voices to the growing chorus of concern and determination. "It won't work," the taller girl snarled, her beautiful face now showing her true nature, ancient, hungry, and utterly inhuman. The faith of the modern world is weak, diluted by science and skepticism. They cannot recreate what the Puritans accomplished. But Edmund could feel something changing in the spiritual atmosphere around the mausoleum. The gathering voices in the living world were creating a resonance that was beginning to affect the supernatural realm where he was trapped. The shadow children were becoming less solid, their forms wavering like smoke in a strong wind. "Faith doesn't require the absence of knowledge," Edmund said, his voice growing stronger as he felt the power building around him. "It requires the presence of love. And those people out there, they're not just praying to repair an ancient seal, they're praying to protect their children, to keep their families safe. That's a faith that transcends any historical period." The mausoleum began to shake, and cracks appeared in the stone walls as the spiritual forces reached a critical threshold. The two girls in white let out screams of rage and desperation as they felt their power beginning to ebb. "You don't understand what you're doing," the shorter girl cried. "Without us, the lonely children will have nowhere to go, no one to comfort them, when the world becomes too painful to bear." "They'll have what every child deserves," Edmund replied, feeling the dimensional barrier beginning to weaken. "They'll have the chance to grow up, to find their own solutions to life's challenges, to become the people they're meant to be." The voices from the living world reached a crescendo, and Edmund felt reality shifting around him like a kaleidoscope, finding its proper pattern. The supernatural cemetery began to fade, replaced by the familiar sight of the real granary burying ground, where Detective Murphy, Mrs. Blackwood, and a gathering of ministers and concerned parents stood in a circle around the mausoleum, their voices raised in collective prayer. As Edmund materialized in the center of their circle, he saw the ancient symbols on the mausoleum beginning to glow with renewed power. The seal was being restored, the spiritual wound healed by the combined faith and determination of people who refused to let evil prey upon their children. But even as victory seemed within reach, Edmund realized that the two girls in white were making one final, desperate attempt to escape the closing trap. They were reaching across the dimensional divide, trying to follow him back into the living world. The final confrontation was about to begin. Edmund materialized in the real cemetery to the gasps and cries of the gathered crowd. Detective Murphy rushed forward to steady him, while Mrs. Blackwood continued her incantations, her eyes fixed on the mausoleum, where the ancient symbols were now blazing with supernatural light. "The children!" Edmund gasped, still clutching his grandmother's cross. "They're trying to break through. The seal isn't complete yet." As if summoned by his words, two translucent figures began to emerge from the stone walls of the mausoleum, the girls in white dresses, their forms wavering between the supernatural realm and the living world. But something was wrong with their appearance. The collective faith of the gathered believers was affecting them, stripping away their beautiful facades to reveal the ancient, hungry entities beneath. Where once there had been the faces of innocent children, now writhing shadows showed their true nature. Their white dresses became tattered shrouds, and their blonde curls transformed into dark tendrils that moved independently of any earthly wind. The assembled crowd stepped back in horror, but their voices never faltered in their prayers. "We will not be denied," the entities spoke in unison, their voices now a cacophony of every child they had ever claimed. "The lonely ones belong to us. They always have, they always will." Mrs. Blackwood stepped forward, her weathered hands steady as she held an ornate silver pendant. "You have no power here anymore. The faithful have spoken, and the seal is restored." "The seal holds us," the first entity snarled, "but it cannot contain what we have already set in motion. The seeds are planted, the doors are opened. Even if you trap us here, others will answer our call." Edmund felt a chill of realization. The Kellerman children, the dozens of other Boston children who had reported seeing mysterious playmates in recent months, they had all been touched by the entity's influence. Even with the ancient creatures contained, their supernatural corruption might continue to spread. "What did you do to them?" Edmund demanded, stepping closer to the mausoleum, despite the waves of malevolent energy radiating from the partially manifested entities. The second creature's laugh was like the sound of breaking glass. "We gave them dreams, historian, beautiful dreams of eternal play, of never being alone, of never facing the disappointments that await all children as they grow. Those dreams will call to them in their darkest moments, and they will remember where to find us." One of the ministers in the circle, an elderly Presbyterian with steel-gray hair, raised his voice above the others. "Then we'll watch over them. Every child who was touched by your evil will be protected by our community. You've underestimated the power of human love and vigilance. The entity's forms began to waver more violently as the renewed faith of the gathered believers pressed against them. The ancient symbols on the mausoleum were now glowing so brightly that they cast sharp shadows across the cemetery, and the bronze door was slowly grinding shut despite the creature's desperate attempts to keep it open. "Dr. Whitmore," Mrs. Blackwood called out, her voice strained with the effort of maintaining her spiritual defenses. "The cross your grandmother gave you. It's been consecrated by generations of faith. Place it against the door. It will help anchor the seal." Edmund approached the mausoleum, feeling the overwhelming malevolence radiating from the partially trapped entities. They reached for him with hands that were no longer even remotely human, their touch leaving frost on his coat and filling the air around him with the scent of grave earth and decay. "You cannot stop the loneliness," one of them whispered, its voice now barely recognizable as having once belonged to a child. "It exists in every human heart, and we are its answer. Destroy us here, and we will simply manifest elsewhere, wherever children cry out for companionship in the darkness." Edmund pressed his grandmother's wooden cross against the bronze door, feeling it grow warm in his hands as its power interacted with the ancient symbols. "Maybe you're right about loneliness," he said, his voice steady despite the supernatural horror surrounding him. "But you're wrong about being its answer. The answer to loneliness isn't eternal imprisonment in a false paradise. It's connection, community, the courage to reach out to the living world even when it's difficult." The gathered crowd's prayers reached a crescendo as the bronze door began to close more rapidly. The entities let out a final, desperate scream that shattered every window in the nearby buildings and sent flocks of birds fleeing from the surrounding trees. "Remember us!" they cried as their forms were pulled back into the mausoleum. "When the children of this city lie awake at night, afraid and alone, they will remember our offer, and someday someone will be desperate enough to accept it." The bronze door slammed shut with a sound like thunder, and the glowing symbols on the mausoleum suddenly went dark. The supernatural cold that had emanated from the structure was replaced by a sense of peace and resolution that seemed to flow outward through the entire cemetery. Edmund staggered backward, the wooden cross now cool in his hands. Around him, the gathered believers slowly stopped their prayers, their faces showing a mixture of exhaustion and relief. Detective Murphy approached with a blanket, wrapping it around Edmund's shoulders. "Is it over?" Murphy asked, his voice hoarse from shouting prayers he hadn't recited since childhood. "The immediate threat is contained," Mrs. Blackwood replied, though her expression remained troubled. "But the entities spoke truly about one thing. They have left their mark on many children in this city. We must be vigilant." Edmund looked around at the faces of the parents, ministers, and community members who had gathered to help repair the ancient seal. Among them were the Kellermans, holding their 3 children close, and other families whose children had reported supernatural encounters in recent weeks. "We'll need to organize," Edmund said, his historian's mind already working on practical solutions. Regular gatherings, support groups for the affected families, education about recognizing supernatural influence. The children who were touched by these entities will need ongoing protection and counseling. Mrs. Blackwood nodded approvingly. "And we'll need to monitor other potential weak points in the spiritual defenses of the city. Boston is old, Dr. Whitmore, and it holds many secrets. This may not be the last supernatural threat we face." As the crowd began to disperse, Edmund found himself standing alone before the sealed mausoleum. The bronze door showed no signs of the supernatural activity that had nearly torn it apart, and the carved symbols had returned to their weathered, innocuous appearance. But Edmund knew that appearances could be deceiving. Somewhere behind that sealed door, ancient entities waited in supernatural imprisonment, their hunger for lonely children temporarily thwarted but not eliminated. And in bedrooms across Boston, children who had been touched by otherworldly influence would struggle with dreams and whispers that promised easy escape from the natural difficulties of growing up. The battle was won, but the war for Boston's children would require eternal vigilance. As Edmund walked home through the familiar streets of his beloved city, he realized that his life had been forever changed. He was no longer simply a historian documenting the past. He had become a guardian protecting the future, a scholar-soldier in humanity's ongoing struggle against the supernatural forces that preyed upon innocence and loneliness. And judging by Mrs. Blackwood's warning about other potential threats, his education in the supernatural was just beginning. 3 weeks had passed since the sealing of the mausoleum, and Boston had settled into what appeared to be normalcy. The broken windows around Beacon Hill had been repaired. The newspaper attributed the supernatural disturbances to unusual atmospheric conditions, and most of the city's residents remained blissfully unaware of how close they had come to a supernatural catastrophe. But Edmund knew better. In his apartment, he had converted his spare bedroom into a research center dedicated to documenting supernatural threats throughout Boston's history. Maps covered the walls, marked with locations of unusual incidents dating back to the colonial period. Filing cabinets held testimonies from witnesses to supernatural encounters, and a growing correspondence with Mrs. Blackwood and other individuals sensitive to otherworldly activity provided him with ongoing intelligence about potential threats. The affected children were showing signs of recovery, though progress was slow and uneven. Edmund had organized weekly meetings for their families, creating a support network that combined practical psychological counseling with spiritual protection. The Kellerman children, in particular, had responded well to the community attention, though they still occasionally woke from dreams filled with singing voices that called to them from beyond the veil. It was during one of these family meetings, held in the basement of St. Matthew's Episcopal Church, that Edmund received the news that would launch his next investigation. Mrs. Sarah Kellerman approached him after the session with a letter that had arrived in her morning mail, her face pale with worry. "Dr. Whitmore, I think you need to see this," she said, handing him an envelope addressed in a child's careful handwriting. "It came today, but it's postmarked from Salem." Edmund's blood chilled as he opened the letter. Inside, written in the same precise script, was a simple message. "Dear Dr. Whitmore, we have heard about your work in Boston. Our children have been having dreams about two girls in white dresses who want them to come and play. Can you help us?" Signed, Mrs. Rebecca Hartwell, Salem Children's Protective Society. Mrs. Blackwood, who had been speaking with another family, noticed Edmund's expression and approached quickly. "What is it?" Edmund handed her the letter, watching her face grow grave as she read. "It's spreading," she said quietly, "just as the entities promised before we sealed them away." "But how is that possible?" Mrs. Kellerman asked. "I thought we trapped those things in the cemetery. We trapped their physical manifestations," Mrs. Blackwood explained, "but their influence, their spiritual corruption, that's harder to contain. Ideas, dreams, supernatural suggestions can travel far beyond the reach of physical barriers." Edmund was already reaching for his coat. "I need to go to Salem immediately. If the entity's influence is spreading to other communities, especially ones with their own history of supernatural activity." "You can't go alone," Mrs. Blackwood said firmly. "Salem's spiritual landscape is far more complex than Boston's. The witch trials of 1692 left scars on that town that have never fully healed. If malevolent entities are manifesting there, you'll need experienced help." Within 2 hours, Edmund and Mrs. Blackwood were on a train bound for Salem, the autumn countryside rushing past their window as they discussed strategy. Edmund had packed his research materials, including detailed notes about the entities they had faced in Boston, while Mrs. Blackwood carried a leather satchel filled with protective amulets and spiritual implements. "Tell me about Salem's supernatural history," Edmund said as they neared their destination. "The witch trials created a massive spiritual wound," Mrs. Blackwood explained, her voice low enough that other passengers couldn't overhear. 20 people executed on charges of witchcraft, most of them innocent. That kind of injustice, that level of fear and paranoia, it leaves marks on a place that can last for centuries. And those marks make it easier for malevolent entities to gain a foothold. Exactly. Salem is like a spiritual magnet for supernatural activity. If the entities we sealed in Boston have found a way to extend their influence there, they could tap into residual energy from the witch trials and become far more powerful than they ever were in our city. The train pulled into Salem as the October sun was setting, casting long shadows across the historic town. Edmund and Mrs. Blackwood made their way through streets lined with colonial architecture and tourist attractions capitalizing on the town's dark history. But beneath the commercialized spookiness, Edmund could sense something genuinely unsettling, a spiritual heaviness that seemed to press down on the very air. They found Mrs. Rebecca Hartwell waiting for them at the Children's Protective Society, a stern-faced woman in her 50s whose no-nonsense demeanor couldn't quite hide her obvious anxiety. She led them into her office, where files and reports covered every available surface. "It started about 2 weeks ago," Mrs. Hartwell began without preamble. "Children from different families, different neighborhoods, all reporting the same dream. 2 girls in white dresses appearing at their bedsides. inviting them to come and play in Gallows Hill. Edmund exchanged a meaningful look with Mrs. Blackwood. Gallows Hill was where the witch trial executions had taken place, one of the most spiritually charged locations in all of New England. "How many children have been affected?" Mrs. Blackwood asked. 17 that we know of," Mrs. Hartwell replied. "But there may be more whose parents haven't reported the incidents. The dreams are becoming more frequent and more vivid. Some of the children have started sleepwalking in the direction of the hill." Edmund felt a sinking sensation in his stomach. If the entities were drawing children to Gallows Hill, they might be planning something far more ambitious than the simple recruitment they had attempted in Boston. They might be trying to use the residual spiritual energy from the witch trials to break free from the supernatural constraints that bound them to their realm. "We need to see Gallows Hill immediately," he said, rising from his chair. "Dr. Whitmore," Mrs. Hartwell said, her voice heavy with concern. "There's something else you should know. 3 of the affected children are missing. They disappeared from their beds last night, and we haven't been able to find any trace of them." As if summoned by her words, a commotion erupted outside the building. Through the window, Edmund could see a crowd gathering in the street, their faces turned upward toward the darkening sky. Following their gaze, he saw something that made his blood freeze. Above Gallows Hill, clearly visible against the twilight sky, 2 figures in white dresses were floating in the air, their forms glowing with an otherworldly light. Even from this distance, Edmund could hear their voices carried on the evening wind, singing the same haunting lullaby he had heard in Boston, but now amplified and strengthened by the spiritual energy of Salem's tortured history. And rising from the hill itself, like wisps of fog given form and purpose, dozens of other figures were beginning to manifest, the spirits of those who had died unjustly, called forth by the entity's supernatural song and bound to their malevolent purpose. "Dear God," Mrs. Blackwood whispered, her face pale in the evening light. "They're not just recruiting children anymore. They're raising an army of the dead." As the ghostly chorus grew louder and more spirits materialized around Gallows Hill, Edmund realized that their battle in Boston had been merely the opening skirmish in a much larger supernatural war. The entities had learned from their defeat, adapted their strategy, and chosen a new battleground where the very soil was saturated with centuries of injustice and supernatural energy. The real fight for the soul of New England was about to begin. The supernatural spectacle above Gallows Hill sent shockwaves of panic through Salem's streets. Citizens pointed and screamed at the ghostly figures materializing in the twilight sky, while children throughout the town began to sleepwalk toward the hill in eerie procession. Edmund watched in horror as the entity's influence spread like a supernatural contagion, drawing the innocent toward their otherworldly gathering. "We need to reach those missing children before the entities complete whatever ritual they're planning," Edmund said, grabbing Mrs. Blackwood's arm. "If they're using Gallows Hill's spiritual energy to amplify their power, they could tear a permanent hole between the world of the living and the realm of the dead," Mrs. Blackwood finished, her voice tight with urgency. "Every restless spirit in New England would be drawn to Salem like moths to a flame." Mrs. Hartwell led them through the panicking streets toward Gallows Hill, her face set with grim determination. "I know these children," she said as they hurried past citizens who stood frozen in supernatural terror. "Tommy Bradshaw, age 7, Sarah Mitchell, age 9, little Mary Corey, only 6 years old. If those things hurt them, the entities don't want to hurt them," Edmund replied, though his words offered little comfort. "They want to recruit them, to add their innocent souls to their eternal playground. But the process," he trailed off, unwilling to voice his fears about what supernatural transformation might do to the children's minds and spirits. As they climbed the winding path toward Gallows Hill, the air around them grew thick with otherworldly energy. The temperature dropped dramatically, and their breath became visible in the suddenly frigid air. Above them, the 2 entities in white dresses continued their haunting song, their voices now joined by a growing chorus of spirits drawn from Salem's dark past. Edmund could see them clearly now, translucent figures in colonial dress, their faces bearing the marks of fear and injustice. These were the spirits of those who had died during the witch trials, both the executed and those who had perished from the stress and trauma of the proceedings. The entities had somehow awakened these restless souls and bound them to their purpose. "There," Mrs. Blackwood pointed toward a cluster of ancient oak trees near the summit of the hill. "I can see the children." The 3 missing children stood in a perfect triangle beneath the largest oak tree, their arms raised toward the floating entities above. Their eyes were closed, but their mouths moved in unison, speaking words in a language that predated any human tongue. Around them, the grass had turned black and withered, and strange symbols were appearing in the earth as if burned there by invisible fire. "They're preparing to cross over," Mrs. Blackwood said urgently. "The children are being used as anchors, living souls to bridge the gap between worlds. If the ritual completes, the entities won't need to rely on dreams and whispers anymore. They'll be able to manifest physically in our reality." Edmund pulled out his grandmother's wooden cross, but he could feel that its power was diminished here on Gallows Hill. The spiritual corruption was too strong, the accumulated weight of centuries of supernatural activity too overwhelming for any single protective charm to overcome. "We need help," he said, scanning the surrounding area desperately. "The same kind of collective faith that worked in Boston, but stronger. Where are Salem's clergy? Where are the people who should be protecting this community?" As if in answer to his plea, voices began to ring out from the base of the hill. A group of local ministers and concerned citizens had gathered, led by a tall man in clerical robes, who raised a large silver crucifix toward the supernatural manifestation above. "Citizens of Salem," the minister called out, his voice carrying clearly through the otherworldly atmosphere. "So we will not allow our town to become a gateway for evil. Join your voices with ours in prayer and drive back these harbingers of darkness." The response was immediate and powerful. Despite their fear, the people of Salem began to climb Gallows Hill, their voices raised in hymns and prayers that seemed to push back against the entity's malevolent influence. The ghostly spirits around the hill wavered and grew less distinct as the collective faith of the living pressed against them. But the entities themselves were not so easily deterred. They had learned from their defeat in Boston and had chosen their battleground carefully. The spiritual energy of Gallows Hill was amplifying their power, making them far stronger than they had been in the granary burying ground. "Your faith is strong," one of the entities called down to the gathering crowd, its voice carrying supernatural authority. "But this ground has been watered with the blood of innocence. Justice denied, lives destroyed by fear and superstition. We offer something your prayers cannot: eternal peace for those who died wrongly, and eternal companionship for the children who choose to join us." Some of the ascending townspeople faltered at these words, their steps slowing as they considered the entity's claims. The witch trials remained a source of shame and guilt for Salem, a historical wound that had never fully healed. The promise of redemption for the unjustly executed was almost irresistible. Edmund realized that the entities were using Salem's historical guilt against its own people, weaponizing the town's shame to weaken their resolve. He needed to counter their psychological manipulation with truth and hope. "Don't listen to them," he shouted, his voice carrying across the hill. "They're not offering redemption, they're offering spiritual slavery. The spirits of those who died unjustly don't need to be trapped in an eternal playground. They need to be acknowledged, honored, and allowed to find peace through proper remembrance." Mrs. Blackwood joined her voice to his, her experience with supernatural entities lending weight to her words. "These creatures feed on guilt and loneliness. They twisted the genuine need for justice into a trap that would destroy both the living and the dead. Salem's redemption comes through learning from its past mistakes, not through surrendering to supernatural predators." The crowd's resolve strengthened, and their prayers grew louder and more unified. The ghostly spirits around the hill began to waver more dramatically, some of them breaking free from the entity's control and fading peacefully into the afterlife as the townspeople's acknowledgement of their suffering gave them the peace they had long sought. But the three children remained trapped in their ritual triangle, their young voices still speaking the otherworldly incantation that threatened to tear reality apart. The entities above them glowed brighter with each passing moment, drawing power from the spiritual chaos they had created. Edmund knew that prayer alone would not be enough to save the children. Someone would have to enter the supernatural field around them and break the ritual by physical intervention. And given the entity's obvious malevolence toward him personally, he was the logical choice for such a desperate gambit. "Keep praying," he told Mrs. Blackwood as he began to move toward the ritual circle. "Whatever happens, don't let the townspeople lose faith. Their collective belief is the only thing preventing this from becoming a full, supernatural invasion." As Edmund approached the withered grass around the oak tree, he felt the entity's attention focus on him like a burning weight. The air around the children crackled with otherworldly energy, and the temperature dropped so low that frost began to form on his clothing. "Dr. Edmund Whitmore," the entities spoke in unison, their voices now carrying the accumulated power of Salem's supernatural heritage. You cannot stop what has already begun. The children have chosen their path, and soon all of Salem's young will join them in eternal play. Edmund stepped into the ritual circle, feeling the supernatural energy slam into him like a physical blow. But his grandmother's cross, though weakened, still provided some protection, and his determination to save the children gave him strength to continue forward. The real battle for Salem's soul was about to reach its climax. As Edmund entered the ritual circle, the supernatural energy struck him with such force that he nearly collapsed. The withered grass beneath his feet felt like walking on broken glass, and the air itself seemed to resist his movement. The three children continued their otherworldly chanting, their young faces serene despite the chaos erupting around them. The entities above shrieked in fury at his intrusion, their beautiful facades completely abandoned now to reveal the writhing shadows beneath. You will not interfere again, historian. This time, you will join them in their eternal rest. Edmund forced himself forward, step by agonizing step, until he reached little Mary Corey, the youngest of the trapped children. Her 6-year-old face was peaceful, almost angelic, but when he touched her shoulder, her skin was cold as winter stone. The supernatural possession was far advanced, too advanced for simple intervention. "Mary," he whispered urgently, "can you hear me? Remember your mother. Remember your home. These aren't friends. They're monsters wearing pretty faces." For a moment, the child's chanting faltered, and her eyes flickered with recognition, but the entity's influence was too strong, and she quickly resumed the otherworldly incantation. Edmund realized that he needed to break the ritual at its source, not by awakening the children individually, but by destroying the spiritual anchor that bound them to the entity's will. He looked up at the massive oak tree that formed the center of the ritual circle. Its ancient trunk was covered with the same symbols he had seen on the mausoleum in Boston, but these were different, older, cruder, carved directly into the living wood. This wasn't just a tree, it was a supernatural conduit, a living bridge between the world of the dead and the realm of the living. "The tree," he called out to Mrs. Blackwood, his voice barely audible over the supernatural chaos. "It's the anchor point. The entities are using it to channel power from Gallows Hill's spiritual wounds." Mrs. Blackwood understood immediately. She began directing the praying townspeople to focus their attention on the oak tree, their collective faith now aimed at severing the supernatural connection rather than simply opposing the entities themselves. The effect was immediate and dramatic. The symbols carved into the tree's bark began to smoke and blacken as the townspeople's unified prayer pressed against them. The entities above let out screams of rage as they felt their power source beginning to weaken. But they weren't finished yet. With a sound like thunder, the two figures in white dresses descended from the sky, landing within the ritual circle with enough force to crack the frozen ground. Up close, with their disguises completely abandoned, they were terrifying beyond description. Towering shadows wearing the rough approximation of human form, their eyes like bottomless pits, and their voices like the whisper of wind through a graveyard. "If we cannot have the children," they spoke in unison, "then we will take you, Edmund Whitmore. Your knowledge of our methods, your ability to see between worlds, these gifts will serve us well in recruiting new victims." Edmund felt their supernatural influence pressing against his mind, trying to convince him that joining them would end his loneliness, his academic isolation, his lifelong search for meaning among dusty books and forgotten documents. For a moment, the offer was almost tempting. Eternal companionship, perfect understanding, an end to the human struggles that had defined his existence. But then he heard something that gave him strength, the sound of children's laughter. Not the hollow, otherworldly mirth of the entities, but genuine joy coming from the base of Gallows Hill. Looking down, he could see that other children from Salem had joined their parents in the prayer circle, their innocent voices adding power to the collective faith that was slowly destroying the supernatural anchor. "You're wrong about loneliness," Edmund said, his voice growing stronger as he watched the community of Salem unite to protect their young. "The answer isn't to escape into some eternal playground where nothing ever changes, nothing ever grows, nothing ever becomes more than it was. The answer is connection, real connection with real people who choose to care about each other, despite their flaws and differences." The entities pressed closer, their shadow forms reaching for him with tendrils of supernatural darkness. But Edmund's grandmother's wooden cross blazed with renewed light, fed by the collective faith of the entire town below. The symbols on the oak tree were now burning away completely, severing the entity's connection to Gallows Hill's spiritual energy. "You speak of connection," one entity hissed, its form beginning to waver as its power diminished. "But you are alone, Edmund Whitmore, a bachelor scholar with no family, no children of your own, no one who will mourn your passing." "I was alone," Edmund corrected, feeling the truth of his words resonate through the supernatural atmosphere. "But I'm not anymore. These people, this community, the families I've helped protect, they've become my family. The children I've saved have become my legacy. That's what real connection means." The three possessed children suddenly stopped their chanting and collapsed to the ground, the entity's weakening power no longer sufficient to maintain control over their young minds. Edmund rushed to gather them into his arms, feeling their bodies grow warm again as the supernatural influence fled. With their human anchors gone and their power source severed, the entities began to fade rapidly. Their forms grew translucent, then transparent, as the collective faith of Salem's people pushed them back toward the supernatural realm where they belonged. "This is not over," they whispered, as they dissolved into nothingness. "There are other towns, other lonely children, other places where the barrier between worlds grows thin. We will return, and we'll be ready for you," Edmund replied, though he was speaking to empty air. The entities were gone, banished back to their realm by the combined power of an entire community united in purpose. The supernatural cold lifted from Gallows Hill like a breaking fever, replaced by the normal October chill of a New England evening. The ghostly spirits that had been drawn to the entity's call faded peacefully away, finally finding the rest that had been denied them for centuries. The oak tree, its supernatural symbols burned away, stood as nothing more than an ordinary tree once again. Edmund carried the three children down the hill to their waiting families, their reunion marked by tears of relief and joy. Mrs. Blackwood walked beside him, her face showing the exhaustion that came from channeling spiritual forces far beyond normal human experience. "Is it truly over?" Mrs. Hartwell asked, as they reached the base of the hill. "For now," Edmund replied honestly, "but they were right about one thing. There are other places where the supernatural world intersects with ours, other communities that might face similar threats. We'll need to build a network, share information, teach others how to recognize and combat such entities." In the weeks that followed, Edmund found himself at the center of a growing movement dedicated to protecting New England's children from supernatural predators. Working with Mrs. Blackwood, local clergy, and concerned parents from multiple communities, he helped establish a network of observers and defenders that stretched from Boston to Salem and beyond. The original photograph that had started his investigation found a place of honor in his apartment, no longer a mystery to be solved, but a reminder of the price of vigilance. He had framed it alongside letters of gratitude from the families he had helped, creating a gallery that spoke to the power of human connection in the face of otherworldly threats. Edmund's days as a simple historian were over, but his new role as a guardian against supernatural evil had brought him something he had never found in his academic pursuits, a true sense of purpose and belonging. He was no longer alone with his books and documents. He was part of a community dedicated to protecting the innocent and preserving the natural order of life and death. And though he knew that other supernatural threats would eventually emerge, Edmund faced the future with confidence. He had learned that the greatest weapon against otherworldly evil was not ancient artifacts or mystical incantations, but the simple human capacity for love, faith, and mutual protection. The children of New England would grow up in a world where dedicated guardians watched over them, where communities stood ready to defend against supernatural predation, and where the line between the living and the dead remained clearly drawn. In his final journal entry about the Salem incident, Edmund wrote, "Evil may be persistent, but so is good. And in the end, the choice between eternal isolation and genuine human connection will always favor those brave enough to choose love over fear, community over solitude, and hope over despair." The photograph of the twin girls would never again show two figures where there should be one, but it would always serve as a reminder that vigilance is the price of protecting innocence, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not by soldiers or politicians, but by ordinary people who refuse to let evil prey upon the vulnerable. Salem slept peacefully that night, its children safe in their beds, dreaming ordinary dreams of ordinary adventures in a world where the living and the dead remained in their proper places. And Edmund Whitmore, no longer a lonely historian but now a guardian of New England's supernatural peace, finally found the restful sleep that had eluded him since his investigation began. The battle was won, but the war for humanity's soul would continue. And Edmund would be ready.